Hello everyone, Dr. Moreno here, and we today are talking about policy structures in music education. Now, before we go on, I must emphasize that I am not a political analyst or policy expert, but I have taught some years, as have many of you, and I've seen policy put into place, at least from a certain authoritative standpoint. Sometimes that policy has been enacted in my classroom. Sometimes it has never quite trickled down to me. I've seen it especially, though, in the classrooms of my core subject colleagues and what it has done for or sometimes to those settings. So this is meant to be an introductory discussion on what policy is, how it comes into play, what that can look like in education and in the music education setting. So let's just ask the obvious question. Why do we care? If we have spent time and years and education and energy and money learning how to teach in our classroom, why do we care about what a government or an administration says that we need to be doing in our classroom? Well, there's a number of reasons. From an organizational standpoint, the idea of governance, that there is a structure for how we do things and why we do things, and consistency, along with stability, consistency across a content area, consistency across a school building, making sure that our students are receiving relatively equal areas of learning and teaching capacities, opportunities for growth, how we're assessing those students, the idea that there is an understood structure for how things are to be done and validated. Sometimes that might not be what you want in a classroom. Sometimes that might be overreaching as compared to other scenarios, but we'll get into that. We care about policy sometimes due to funding. What policy says should be taking place and how that is taking place oftentimes goes hand in hand with whether or not funding is made available. And so understanding when funding that we could receive for our classrooms is tied to policy is very important for how we make decisions about what we do in our classrooms, about what we do within our careers. Just a basic understanding of that is a really important item to consider. And then expectations, which goes along with the idea of governance and support and stability and consistency. What is expected of us as educators? What is expected regarding the content that we provide? What is expected regarding the way we assess our students? What is expected regarding the various educational opportunities that we provide in and out of the classroom? Sometimes policy determines those expectations. Sometimes it doesn't determine those at all. Sometimes it says, here's a policy, do what you want with it. And we'll talk about that. But understanding that these different kinds of areas come into play when we're talking about policy forms a basis for why we need to care about some of these elements. Here is an introductory video from some of the NAFME folks to give a brief, again, introduction into some policy definitions, and then we'll get more into it afterwards.
Hello, my name is Carla Aguilar, and I'm a member of the Policy ASPA of the Society for Music Teacher Education. In this presentation, I'm going to address the question, what is policy in music education? A Google search of the word policy brings up the definition, a course or principle of action adopted or proposed by a government, party, business, or individual. This definition indicates that policies are actions from different kinds of entities. Policies exist in all aspects of education, including music education. In an important article, Patrick Jones suggests that policies are of two types, hard policies and soft policies. Jones defines hard policies as compulsory requirements. In music education, we might think of state or federal government mandates as hard policies. Contemporary state-level policy concerns may include teacher evaluation, licensure, and content area standards. The main federal education law is the Every Student Succeeds Act. Soft policies are those policies that are decided on a local level. In music education, we might think of post-secondary admission processes, district curricula, and building level scheduling as soft policies. While music educators interact with both hard and soft policies, we have the ability to influence both as well. Music teachers across all levels can learn about hard and soft policies that influence their work. Websites, social media feeds, and emails are some of the best ways to know about and keep up on what is happening with educational policies. Some of these sites and social media feeds include the National Education Association, Education Week, Americans for the Arts, Chalkbeat, the National Education Policy Center, and federal and state departments of education. Music teachers can learn when there are comment periods for state-level hard and soft policies. They can also request to be on district or school-level scheduling committees. It is our responsibility to continue to understand the influence of hard and soft policies on our work and to ensure that the policies in place support all students and teachers.
So there's your definition. A course or principle of action adopted or proposed by a government, party, business, or individual. When we're reading the chapter and the readings associated with this week's module, and we're considering policy from an educational standpoint, we might automatically be thinking about governmental policy, but it doesn't have to be something that large. It can be something by one person. You can have policies in your classroom. Businesses have policies, organizations have policies, teachers have policies. So it's basically just the statement of something that you expect to do, to put into place, right? So there's two different ways that people can look at or define a policy, and they can look at it from a literal or traditional standpoint, something that is official and is enacted by those in power at different levels of governance. And these could be things like a law or a statute, an official declaration from a government agency, or something that is officially adopted by a local school board. So when considering policy from a literal or traditional standpoint, you're considering that it is something that is clear and active and is put into place exactly as it reads. So it's the letter of the law, if you will. But there is another way that we could look at that, and it could be the critical or discursive definition. And you'll see, by the way, that both of these items, I'm taking these definitions directly out of the text. Shaw is the author of this particular chapter, but it is out of the Conway, just for clarity. The critical or discursive definition, or somebody who defines policy in that manner, would be that you have, yes, this official letter of the law item, plus reading between the lines, underlying rhetoric or discourse, and the way that policy text defines power relationships. So, we look at policies or laws or statutes, and we look at the actual text of what they say and what they're supposed to do. And that would be just the literal way of looking at it. But there would also be the critical way of looking at it by saying, yes, this is what it says in black and white, in ink on the paper, but what does that look like in my classroom? How do I actually define that in the day-to-day actions and teaching processes in my classroom? How do I define that based on the outcomes of student learning? This particular item doesn't necessarily speak clearly to a music classroom. Maybe it speaks to a classroom, and then I define that further out from there. So we see this all the time in how courts determine the Constitution, or how they translate the Constitution, or how they understand the Constitution. So the Constitution of the United States does not give specific things for every single thing that happens in this country. So they have to interpret it in different ways. They look at it from a literal and critical perspective. We heard a couple other terms in that recording as far as descriptions of policy, and that would be soft versus hard. So a soft policy is something that's loose, it's flexible, it encourages change throughout. It's not necessarily intended to be hard and fast beyond what it says. Soft policies are things that are not usually required. They're often participation is voluntary, whether or not you choose to do something. These soft policies, if they grow in people's understanding and people's estimation to something that feels like it should be implemented on a broader level or a more prescriptive level, they can often lead to a hard policy, which is typically more strict, prescriptive, very clear lines of incentive and reward. There's not a whole lot of room for interpretation or hopefully confusion, although you never know. Participation in a hard policy is typically enforced to some level. So some examples of these in education, soft policy would be, and we'll look at these a little bit more in depth in the next video, but a soft policy might be the NAFME standards. The government did not say you must do this. Congress said these are great, we like them, do what you will. And so then from there, it was up to individual states and or corporations or districts to determine how they wanted to do that. But there's not really a formula for enforcing the NAFME standards from a macro governmental level. A hard policy would be things like No Child Left Behind, where this is how this is going to be. Teachers must have this level of education. These kind of tests must be done in the classroom, et cetera, et cetera. They were required and enforced with funding hanging in the balance. So there's an example of understanding what the policies are that oversee your area of expertise. So again, soft, loose, flexible, hard, strict, prescriptive, not flexible. You might argue that soft policies are better for education because they allow us to make change as necessary. You might argue that hard policies are better for education because they provide a clearer structure and a sense of consistency across. You might argue that we need a combination of both. You get to make that determination for yourself. Just a couple more ideas on policy descriptions. Before and after. This is not rocket science, but let's talk about it anyway. The before idea would be the formation of a policy. When people are negotiating what is going to be in this policy, how are we going to enforce it? What are we going to require? How are we going to determine the efficacy and determining an agenda? Now, that agenda could be a timeline. That agenda could also be what the various involved parties are requiring or demanding in the building and implementation of this policy. And then you have after the implementation itself. This is ongoing even after adoption. So a policy is put forth, proposed, suggested. It is then discussed and negotiated, and then it is set forth. It is adopted or put into place by whatever governing body is in place, whether it be the government or a school board or what have you. And the implementation, the after setting, continues after that adoption. Think about it. When you are told as an educator that you must put this particular assessment into place, you have to prepare for that. You have to actually do it, and then you have to synthesize it. If you have to do that assessment maybe every semester, it's ongoing. Just because it was adopted doesn't mean that we're done with it. We have to continue on from there. Some of the overarching policies that we've seen in the last few decades are those of educational standards, or those relating to educational standards and teacher accountability. So let's break these ideas down. Learning standards. They describe what students should know and be able to do. Related to those would be the learning objectives, the ever-famous SWOBOT. What should a student be able to do at the end of this lesson? What should a student be able to know and communicate at the end of this unit? So learning standards, when you are considering curriculum, because that's what we're talking about, right? Learning standards should be an influencing factor. What you want students to know and be able to do should play a role somewhere in your curriculum design. It shapes instruction. Curriculum, in turn, shapes instruction on a week-to-week and day-to-day basis. So putting policy aside for a moment, right, and just considering your classroom itself, looking at how you're going to organize content, how you're going to organize structure, where are your performances, where's your literacy, what do you want students to know and be able to do by the time they leave your classroom, at the quarter, at the semester, at the end of the year, what have you. So considering those things, considering the standards that they're going to be able to demonstrate, right? Then putting that into play day by day, week by week, is the implementation of your curriculum, right? A couple other elements of standards would be related to teacher accountability. So pre-service standards, standards of teacher preparation program, they may or may not be specific to content areas. So for example, when it comes to student teaching, student teachers are required to do certain things regardless of their content area. Here at Ball State, we utilize the EdTPA system, the EdTPA assessment system. And so student teachers are required to turn in various forms of written and recorded evidence to showcase their knowledge of the school, of the classroom they're working in, elements of planning, of lesson planning, and considering the students in the class, devising lessons, implementing those lessons, devising assessments, implementing those assessments, reflecting all along the way, and then submitting that document. So there are standards that go along with that process that all student teachers from Ball State are required to do, regardless of content area. Now, within our music education program, we do have specific things that they're required to do as far as their field experience and their practicums, things that the Teachers College certainly supports and may also require, but we may also have different kinds of stipulations based on what we want them to do because it's a music education setting that is going to look very different from a math setting or a general elementary setting, right? And then, of course, you have in-service standards. And these standards influence teacher practice and may drive assessment of teacher success. We'll get to these in a couple minutes. Yes, in this, I can't remember if it's this presentation or the next one, but go with me. The idea that teachers are evaluated at certain points throughout, the year. Sometimes it's once a year, sometimes it's 2 or more times. Teachers that are in subject areas or content areas that have yearly testing. There are different sort of ways to assess teacher success based on those things. So different levels of standards that all can have a foundation or at least be monitored from a policy perspective. So let's start connecting the dots between curriculum and policy, beginning with a brief timeline. And I say brief because I think there's fewer than 10 items in this timeline, but it'll give a basic introduction to what has gone on over the last few decades. If you recall from your educational history or music education history coursework, the launch of the Sputnik in the 60s launched also a massive emphasis on education, especially math and science, but other subjects benefited as well from that emphasis. And so that was sort of the dawning of a new era, if you will, quoting Scar from The Lion King. Until in 1989, the math teachers said, we need some standards. And so the National Council of Teachers of Mathematics released a new set of math standards. And this just continued encouraging other groups to do something similar. In 94, the Clinton administration put forth Goals 2000, which was a fairly large educational reform program that included, among other things, requirements for testing in reading and math. However, it didn't really have legs to it. It dissolved in less than a decade, and that did not bode well, considering in the same year there was the formation of the National Education Standards and Improvement Council, tasked with developing national standards for areas across the curriculum, not just math and reading. This was also unsuccessful. No council members were ever appointed. Funding pretty much was removed from these projects and implemented into other areas. But that did not stop people from trying to utilize policy towards educational standards. Fortunately for us, NAFME, at the time known as MENC, the Music Educators National Conference, developed a task force in the same year, in 1994. And they put together the initial set of national standards for music education, which you can see below, and you are very likely already at least familiar with. And this is one of those examples of soft policy. The U.S. Congress adopted them, said, great, we love them, put them to work, but there was no requirement or enforcement for that. It was very much voluntary. That being said, many, if not all of the individual states adopted these into their own educational systems in some way. How far that trickled down into actual classrooms is a different story. Again, because it was soft and not hard, implementation was voluntary. So some schools saw these very highly and very successfully implemented. Other schools did not. For myself, I was aware of them. My state at the time was not overly concerned with utilizing them. And so my school district wasn't I think, even terribly aware of them. So it was largely up to me. And I wanted to implement them. Unfortunately, I really didn't know a lot about how to do that. I've learned a lot in the years since then. And I'm grateful for what came later with their updated standards, which we'll get to in a moment. But all of that took place in 94. You had the creation or the formation of Goals 2000 and the council looking at curriculum and looking at testing, but just never really went anywhere. However, MENC/NAFME said, let's run with it, still having success to this day. Then we hit 2001 and No Child Left Behind, an educational reform of the Bush administration. There are lots of thoughts to think and lots of feelings to feel about this program. I would like to present it to you from an unbiased, factual standpoint. This program placed a heavy emphasis on teacher preparation evaluation and school and overall student and overall school achievement. Funding for individual schools could be added to or taken away based on adequate yearly progress, the AYP of a school. This was determined largely by student test scores. These items were disproportionately harsh towards schools that were in urban and or high poverty and or majority minority districts. The state I was teaching in when I first began every year would put out a list of all of the public schools in the state and where they were in their AYP. And if you were looking at a teaching job, if you were looking for a teaching job at the time, you might look at those scores and think, I maybe should look somewhere else, because after a certain number of years of a school not meeting the required score for AYP, there was a chance that they could lose funding. And so you could see that idea of it being disproportionately harsh towards urban, high poverty, majority minority districts. You could see that being the case. It wasn't difficult to understand why that would be the case, and yet it was incredibly unfair to those places. If a school is lacking in funding, how are they going to procure the resources, much less the teaching staff, needed to help their students learn and achieve to a level that the tests say they need to? A lot of philosophical questions there. We do not have time for those today, but if you taught in any of the NCLB years, you know what I'm talking about. No Child Left Behind did not recognize the arts as core subjects. Many programs, as a result, were limited or even cut because they were thinking, well, we need that time for students to be better prepared in those core subjects, which are the areas we're testing on. So why bother with these other things when we can use that time to better our scores, better our test scores, and better our AYP score, and better our chance for more funding? It's a vicious cycle. Teacher evaluations were also part of this, and it was not uncommon for teachers to alter their teaching the day of an evaluation, or even to just try to fit things within what they were already doing, because they knew the content that they were providing was valuable, but what if that wasn't what was being tested on? There was a lot of trial and error in the classroom. It was a challenging time. Fortunately, this did not stop the artists. In 2011, we saw the formation of the National Coalition for Core Art Standards. And these fine folks developed or came together to develop and to oversee standards across the arts. It was very much a co-op between music, visual art, fine art, dance, theater, all of these areas to support national art standards. Just a few years later, not out of that, but very largely related to and supported by that institution, NAFME released a new set of national standards. These were, you've seen like documents where they're comparing and contrasting the 94 standards and the 14 standard, or the 1994 standards and the 2014 standards, right? And you can see similarities, but there's also quite a bit of expansion in the 2014 standards. some similarities and differences. They were still voluntary, so still soft policy, still adopted, adapted, what have you, by individual states. However, this time there was a major emphasis on music literacy, and you can see that in those standards. Instead of having just 9 flat standards, we had now 4 sort of macro overarching standards: creating, performing, responding, connecting. And then 11 sort of micro standards or common anchors underneath those. And they are described or expanded in the realm of enduring understandings and essential questions. So you've got your macro standard of creating, and underneath that there's 2 or 3 of these micro standards or these common anchors that all are very specifically written out to encourage music creation in different ways. And then from there, most of you have probably seen these also, from there you have different levels. It's in a rubric format, right? Different levels of what it looks like to meet this standard at this level, what it looks like to meet the standard at this level. And what's great is there are different examples and samples of activities that you could do along the way. They've really built this out into something that could be implemented in any classroom, largely regardless of resources or of funding. If you know your content area, you can implement these at least to a baseline level, and your students will continue to learn and grow along the way. This was by no means the deepest dive into policy, but just a little bit of an introduction to get us thinking about policy and how it may inform your curricular decisions, how it may inform your curricular structure, how it may inform the content that you teach, how it may inform the way you assess, how it may inform the resourcing that you have through funding and administrative support. There's a lot to be said for wait and see when it comes to governmental educational policy. There was one year that certain decisions were being made at the national level that really frustrated me. And I was very concerned about what that was going to look like for my own classroom. And my dad, not tongue-in-cheek, but not completely untongue-in-cheek, pointed out, is it's going to be years if that reaches your classroom, if at all, because of what it was at the time. He wasn't wrong. It never came to my classroom because other individuals were put into place to do different things throughout those years. And also, I ended up leaving the classroom to get my doctorate during that time. So it was kind of a non-issue after that. But there are times where a policy may never reach you, especially if it's from the national level. There are times where it may reach you right away. Being aware is the key. Understanding what policy might look like in your state, in your district or corporation, in your school, in your classroom. Having that basic understanding is the place to start. And so as you consider different kinds of curricula throughout the semester, as you consider your curriculum project along the way, I wouldn't say that you need to keep policy in mind. However, implementation of said curriculum project in your future would certainly bear that in mind. So a couple closing thoughts from the text on these ideas. These are, again, both from Shaw's writing. And he says, separating formation from implementation can be challenging, as local actors are, in a sense, constantly remaking policies, even as they participate in implementation. So if you are in a setting, if you are in a position to be involved in the development of policy, perhaps at a citywide level or a district level, I should say, recognizing that things may change along the way of that formation. And so you might have an idea of implementation at the beginning. You might have in your mind, all right, this is the policy that we're going to be building, and this is the way it's going to be implemented. That implementation may look very different in the after setting than it does in the before setting, because of people who might come in, people who might leave, different perspectives. There might be funding changes, so many different reasons that it could change. So again, that beginning to end process can look very different than you might initially think. He also says, when a district names some courses as core and others as encore, the critical policy analyst points to the power dynamics at play. This is not intended to be a doom and gloom kind of scenario, but it is often the case that music and the arts in general are seen as an encore course, an encore area, and therefore we may not benefit from the same level of policy focus as other areas might be. That being said, sometimes we do benefit from not being in the forefront of that because we are allowed the freedom to design our curriculum and our classes as we may. And here's an anecdote to kind of put that into perspective. When I started teaching, and I was in a great place. My first 6 years in the same school district was a great opportunity for me to grow up in my teaching career. However, it was a very small district. They placed a much larger emphasis on athletics and on the sciences than they did on the arts. And so to that end, I always knew that I had the support of my administration on a personal level. I knew that they believed in what I did, and I knew that they supported me as a teacher and my students as part of that program. But the support it sort of fizzled there, in the sense that my instructions were teach choir, put on 3 to 4 concerts a year, period. And that was it. Those were the only expectations that were laid on me. I was observed, I think, once or twice I was observed 1 to 2 times every year, and that was it. And so I did not have curriculum requirements. I did not have content requirements. Oh, the one other requirement was that our winter concert had to be, the repertoire in our winter concert, at least 50% of it had to be fully secular. But other than that, I could do whatever I wanted or felt was needed in the content. So I was not playing it fast and loose, but I was making it up as I went along those first couple of years because there were no restrictions. So I had freedom, but I didn't have clear understandings of what was necessary. Should I, based on my education? Absolutely. That's a different story. So I was implementing soft policy on my own along the way because there was no hard policy that governed what I was doing. Not really, right? That also meant that I didn't really have a lot of grounds to go and ask for more because it wasn't made available from the beginning. Does that make sense? Again, great first years in teaching. I learned so much about myself as a teacher, but policy did and did not play a role in a lot of the things that I did in my classroom and a lot of the things that I had to just learn along the way. If I were to go back, I would like to have paid more attention to the standards. I would like to have paid more attention to what they could have meant for my classroom. I would like to have asked for support. The fact that I was only governed by soft policy really could have actually made it easier for me to garner some support that I didn't know was available. So things to think about for you in your own areas. If you are aware of the policies that govern your district or school corporation and things that are available to you as a result, fantastic. If you're not, here's a chance to start doing some exploring. So with that, one final thought is you have an assignment coming up soon. And it is a philosophy of music education, your personal statement of your philosophy of music education. And you can see in the assignment description there a couple different things laying out the expectations. You're going to be addressing 3 primary questions. Why should music be in schools? What kinds of music should be included in the curriculum? And who should teach music in the schools? Now, you have all spent time teaching in schools and studios and community programs, etc. This is based fully on your own experience and your own perspective. Many of you have likely already written something like this, perhaps for an undergraduate program, perhaps if you've been in the history and philosophy course with Dr. Speaker, I know you've written one of these. This is not quite as in-depth as that, but it is a place to start for continuing your thoughts on curriculum, because at the end of the day, if you can't answer these particular questions, how in the world are you going to decide what matters in your classroom? I would encourage you, as it says in the description, to take a look back through some of the readings that we've done just in these first couple weeks. Look through the discussions with your peers and consider, again, heavily your own experiences. my statement today, after being in education for over 20 years, would absolutely have there would be some things that continue to ring true, but there would be so much more based on the experiences that I've had teaching and learning from my teaching and learning from my students and from my peers and colleagues along the way. So that assignment is forthcoming. It is due at the end of, I believe, the third module. Hold on. Nope, end of the second module. My apologies. At the end of this module, there you go. 2 to 3 pages. I would love to see clear and organized writing. You can take a look at the rubric that is associated with the assignment. But I always love reading these statements. It gives me a little bit of insight into who the students are and what they really value. I will tell you, as a bit of a preface to this, my undergraduate students do a similar assignment at the beginning of choral methods. It is their first true foray into choral education coursework, and they come back to it a few times then over that year, and it is always fascinating to see how their perceptions have changed after spending some time actually out in the classrooms. And it just is exciting to see where they are at the end of that. You guys will not be returning to this for this class at the end of the semester, but as I said, I look forward to reading your thoughts, where you've been, where you're kind of going with this, and the value that you place on these ideas in your own teaching. So, questions along the way, you know how to reach me. I will see you in the next video. Take care.